Have you ever wondered how the United States conquered the world without firing a single shot? How a thin piece of paper, printed with green ink, became more powerful than armies, fleets, or empires that ruled for centuries? This is not a story of soldiers, tanks, or invasions. It is a story of money, of how the dollar was turned into a weapon, so subtle, so embedded, that most of the world never realized it was at war. Because the most remarkable part of America's rise is not that it defeated rivals. It's that it replaced conquest itself. No marching troops. No colonies painted red or blue on maps. Just contracts, credit, and promises written in ink instead of blood. Today, the world bows to the dollar. But very few remember the secret war that made it king. Before the dollar, the old order before America's money ruled the world, something else did. Gold. And the British pound. For more than a century before World War I, London was the heart of global finance. Ships crossed oceans carrying goods, and nearly every major transaction, from India to Argentina, was settled in pounds, convertible into gold. It was a system built on discipline. You could not print gold. You could not vote for more of it. Empires lived or died by what sat in their vaults. This discipline made Britain powerful, but it also made the system brittle. By the early 1900s, European empires were straining under their own ambitions. Armies grew, navies expanded, colonies demanded administration, and the costs began to exceed what even the world's largest empire could sustain. Gold, once a source of strength, became a cage. And then, in 1914, the cage shattered. The war that broke gold World War I devoured money at a scale no civilization had ever witnessed. Men, machines, ammunition, fuel, entire economies were fed into the battlefield. Gold drained from vaults as governments scrambled to pay for survival. One by one, the unthinkable happened. Britain suspended gold convertibility. France followed. Germany abandoned restraint altogether. The standard that had kept currencies honest collapsed under the weight of total war. And in that moment, something historic occurred. The financial center of the world began to move west. Across the Atlantic, the United States was watching carefully and counting. America's quiet advantage officially, America was neutral. In reality, it became something far more powerful. The banker of the war. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and New York roared day and night. Weapons, food, fuel, and raw materials poured across the Atlantic. And every shipment had to be paid for. In dollars, Europe did not just buy American goods. It borrowed American money to do so. By 1917, J.P. Morgan alone had arranged billions of dollars in loans for Britain and France, some so large they reshaped global finance. This is the first hidden lesson. America did not conquer territory. It conquered credit. While Europe bled, the United States accumulated gold, expanded its banking system, and built the infrastructure of a new financial empire. When the war ended, the world owed America money. And more importantly, it owed America trust. By 1919, the United States held more than half of the world's gold reserves. The balance of power had shifted, quietly, permanently. The world after war Europe emerged from World War I shattered. Factories lay in ruins. Governments were bankrupt. Entire populations were traumatized. The United States stood alone, still solvent, still industrial, still expanding. And when nations needed to rebuild, there was only one place to turn: Wall Street. Throughout the 1920s, American loans flowed abroad like salvation. Germany borrowed dollars to pay war reparations. Britain borrowed dollars to rebuild industry. France borrowed dollars to stabilize its currency. The dollar became the world's lifeline, not because it was imposed, but because there was no alternative. This is how real empires are built, not through force, but through dependence. The first warning, but systems built on credit are fragile. When confidence breaks, everything breaks. In 1929, the illusion collapsed. Markets crashed. Capital froze. Trade imploded. The Great Depression was not just an economic disaster. It was a global crisis of faith. Gold vanished into vaults. Currencies devalued. Governments panicked. And from that chaos emerged a realization no one could ignore. The world needed a single monetary anchor, and Britain could no longer provide it. That realization would soon become destiny, the meeting that crowned a king. In 1944, while bombs still fell across Europe, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered in a quiet hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. They were not planning a war. They were ending one, and writing the constitution of the modern financial world. What they created would crown the dollar as king. But the brilliance of that system, and the trap it set, only becomes clear when you understand what came next. Because this was not the end of the war. It was the moment America stopped fighting battles and started writing the rules. When the delegates arrived at Bretton Woods in 1944, the war was not yet over. Cities still burned. Europe lay in ruins. Empires that had ruled for centuries were financially exhausted. But the outcome was already clear. The old monetary order had died in the trenches of 2 world wars, and something new was about to replace it. Bretton Woods. Designing a financial empire, the Bretton Woods Agreement was presented as cooperation, stability, reconstruction, peace through economic order. But beneath the language was a quiet transfer of power. Here was the design. Every major currency would be pegged to the US dollar. The dollar alone would be convertible into gold at $35 an ounce. And here was the unspoken fact that made it all work. The United States held nearly 2/3 of the world's gold. No other nation could credibly anchor a system like this. Britain was bankrupt. France was shattered. Germany was defeated. Japan was broken. So the world accepted the dollar, not out of love, but necessity. This was not conquest. It was coronation. The hidden genius of the system on the surface, Bretton Woods looked fair. Currencies were fixed. Exchange rates were stable. Trade could flow again. But the system contained a hidden advantage that only America fully understood. To trade, to rebuild, to settle international debts. Other nations needed dollars. And the only way to hold dollars in large quantities was to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. In other words, the world financed America. The United States could now issue debt in its own currency, and foreign governments would eagerly buy it. French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing later called this the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money that everyone else must use. Past empires conquered with armies. America conquered with a balance sheet. Financial imperialism replaces colonies. As European empires dissolved, something subtler replaced them. Financial imperialism. The dollar became the bloodstream of global trade. Oil, food, machinery, raw materials, all priced in dollars. If a nation wanted to participate in the global economy, it needed access to U.S. currency. This gave Washington a power no empire had ever possessed: the ability to isolate an enemy without firing a shot. Banks could be cut off from the dollar system. Accounts frozen. Trade halted. Sanctions became the new siege warfare. In the age of empires, cannons took cities. In the modern era, spreadsheets do. And every nation understood the threat, even if few spoke it aloud. The paradox of dollar dominance here is the paradox at the heart of America's financial empire. Even when the United States causes global instability, the dollar grows stronger. Crises in Latin America in the 1980s, Asia in the 1990s, Russia in 1998. Each time, capital fled toward U.S. Treasury bonds. When fear rises, money runs to the dollar. The storms America creates often become the winds that keep its empire afloat. This is not luck. It is structural. The crack in the foundation, but even financial empires face limits. By the late 1960s, America was spending more than it earned. Vietnam, social programs, global commitments. Dollars flooded the world. Foreign governments began to do the math. They started redeeming dollars for gold. America's vaults began to empty. And on an August night in 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that should have ended the empire. He closed the gold window. The dollar would no longer be backed by gold. Every previous empire that debased its money had collapsed. Rome mixed tin into silver. France printed assignats. But America survived. Because the world had no alternative. The dollar no longer needed gold. It had something more powerful: dependence. The question that hangs once the dollar was freed from gold, it became pure trust. A promise backed not by metal, but by belief. And belief is fragile. So how did America reinforce that trust after breaking the last restraint? How did it turn a fiat currency into something the world still needed to breathe? The answer lies not in vaults or treaties, but in oil. When the gold link was cut in 1971, the dollar should have collapsed. History suggested it would. Every empire before that debased its currency eventually paid the price. Rome's silver denarius became copper. Revolutionary France's paper assignats disintegrated into worthlessness. Confidence vanished and power followed. So why didn't that happen to the dollar? Because the United States moved faster than history expected. Oil replaces gold in the early 1970s. The world faced a new reality. Gold no longer anchored money. But modern civilization had another anchor. Energy. Oil powered everything. Transportation, industry, agriculture, electricity. Without it, economies did not slow down, they stopped. Washington understood this before anyone else. In 1974, the United States struck a quiet, decisive deal with Saudi Arabia. The agreement was simple and revolutionary. Saudi oil would be sold exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would guarantee the kingdom's security and political survival. Soon, the rest of OPEC followed. From that moment on, if a country wanted to buy oil, it needed dollars. Not gold, not sterling, not francs or yen. Dollars. The dollar had found its new foundation. The dollar becomes oxygen. This changed everything. Oil was no longer just a commodity. It became a monetary mechanism. Every nation, whether friendly or hostile to the United States, now needed dollars to function, to drive cars, to power factories, to heat homes, to grow food. This forced countries to do one of three things: earn dollars through exports, borrow dollars from global markets, or hold dollar reserves. All three paths reinforced the same outcome: global dependence on U.S. currency. The dollar was no longer just money. It was oxygen. The Federal Reserve becomes global as oil demand locked in dollar demand. Another institution quietly rose to global influence: the Federal Reserve. When the Fed set interest rates, the entire world felt it. Raising rates pulled capital back into the United States, starving emerging markets of funding. Lowering rates pushed dollars outward, inflating asset bubbles abroad. For developing nations, this created a brutal cycle. Borrow dollars during good times. Struggle to repay them when U.S. rates rise. Face crisis, austerity, and collapse. Latin America learned this in the 1980s. Asia learned it in the 1990s. Russia learned it in 1998. Each time, the pattern repeated. And each time, when panic hit, global capital ran toward U.S. Treasury bonds. The dollar strengthened, even when America caused the storm. The sanctions weapon with dollar dominance came something unprecedented: financial siege power. The United States no longer needed navies to blockade ports. It could freeze bank accounts, cut off dollar clearing, expel countries from payment systems like SWIFT. Trade would halt, currencies would collapse, economies would suffocate. Sanctions became the modern equivalent of siege warfare. Silent, legal, devastating. And every nation understood the implication: defy Washington and risk being cut off from the financial bloodstream of the world. The brilliant paradox here is the paradox that makes the dollar empire so resilient. Every global crisis strengthens it. A crash in Asia, money flees to dollars. A war in Europe, capital rushes into treasuries. A debt crisis somewhere else, the dollar rises. Fear does not weaken the system. It feeds it. This is why every major meltdown, 1987, 1997, 2008, 2020, somehow ends with the dollar more dominant than before. Not by accident, by design. The cost of exorbitant privilege, but privilege always carries risk. Because when a nation can print without restraint, temptation follows. Mounting deficits, ballooning debt, political paralysis. The United States began to consume more than it produced, borrowing against the future while the world financed the present. For decades, this worked, because belief held. But belief is not permanent. The challenge emerges today. Cracks are forming. China builds alternative payment systems. Russia trades energy outside the dollar. Nations experiment with digital currencies and local settlement, not because the dollar is weak, but because it is too powerful. History teaches this lesson repeatedly. Every empire provokes resistance simply by existing, and the end of financial empires does not come with collapse. It comes with diversification, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. The question that remains: the dollar is still king, but every king rules on borrowed belief. What happens when enough nations decide that dependence is too dangerous? What happens when trust begins to fragment? The end will not arrive with headlines. It will arrive with whispers. And when belief finally cracks, the most powerful weapon America ever built will turn inward. The most dangerous thing about the dollar empire is not its strength. It is its invisibility. Most empires announce themselves with borders, flags, and soldiers. America's financial empire does none of that. It lives inside contracts, inside balance sheets, inside the assumptions of everyday trade. And because it feels normal, it feels permanent. That is always when empires are most vulnerable. How power moved from force to finance in the 19th century. Power meant territory. In the early 20th century, it meant industry. By the late 20th century, it meant liquidity. The United States learned this lesson earlier than anyone else. Why occupy land when you can control payment? Why govern colonies when you can govern credit? A country that controls the world's reserve currency doesn't need to conquer nations. It only needs them to participate, and participation comes with rules. Hold dollars, trade in dollars, borrow in dollars, obey the system, or be excluded from it. This is why the dollar system is so resilient. It does not rely on fear alone. It relies on convenience. The modern battlefield today, the decisive battles of geopolitics, do not begin with gunfire. They begin with rate hikes. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, capital flows change instantly. Investors pull money out of emerging markets and rush it back into U.S. assets. Currencies collapse. Debt becomes unpayable. Imports skyrocket in price. Governments fall, not because of invasion, but because their economies break. This is not theory. It has happened again and again. Mexico in the 1980s, Asia in 1997, Turkey, Argentina, Sri Lanka more recently. Each time, the same mechanism. Dollar strength becomes global weakness. And each time, Washington claims neutrality. It's just monetary policy. But history tells a different story. The sanctions age the dollar's dominance also gave birth to a new kind of warfare. Sanctions. In earlier centuries, a siege required armies and months of bloodshed. Today, it requires access to databases. Cut a country off from dollar clearing, and its trade collapses. Freeze reserves, and its currency implodes. Blacklist banks, and capital flees overnight. Iran learned this. Venezuela learned this. Russia is learning this now. The message to the rest of the world is unmistakable. The dollar system is not neutral infrastructure. It is a strategic weapon, and every weapon eventually provokes countermeasures. The slow rebellion no empire collapses because it is hated. It collapses because alternatives slowly become tolerable. China does not need to overthrow the dollar tomorrow. It only needs to reduce exposure. So it builds parallel systems, bilateral trade agreements, local currency settlements, digital payment rails. Russia does the same. So do regional blocs across Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. None of this makes headlines. That's the point. The end of financial empires never begins with panic. It begins with hedging. The trust problem: the dollar is not backed by gold. It is backed by belief. Belief that U.S. debt will be honored. Belief that institutions will function. Belief that political chaos will not overwhelm financial discipline. So far, that belief has held. But history offers a warning. Every empire mistakes trust for permanence. Spain believed silver would last forever. Britain believed sterling would always rule. Both were wrong, not because their currencies failed suddenly, but because their obligations eventually exceeded belief. The United States now runs deficits measured in trillions. Debt grows faster than the economy. Politics grow more fractured. None of this ends the empire tomorrow. But empires don't end tomorrow. They end gradually. The modern parallel, if this feels abstract, look at the pattern. In 1929, faith in markets broke. In 1971, faith in gold broke. In 2008, faith in banks broke. In 2020, faith in restraint broke. Each time, the response was the same. More liquidity, more promises, more debt. Each time, power concentrated further upward. The dollar survived every crisis. But survival is not the same as invincibility. What this means for you living under a dollar empire feels stable, until it doesn't. As long as belief holds, the system rewards participation. As belief weakens, it punishes complacency. Money is power only while it is trusted. Governments can print currency. They cannot print faith. That is why real wealth has always outlived monetary regimes. Skills, resources, production, knowledge. These survive transitions. Paper promises rarely do. The final warning, the secret war that made the dollar king, was never declared. It was fought through patience, through policy, through quiet advantage, and it was won long ago. But history is ruthless with empires that confuse belief with truth. The dollar's real weapon is not paper. It is confidence. And confidence, once cracked, never returns in the same form. The end will not come with collapse. It will come with choice, when the world decides it no longer wants a single throne. And when that happens, the most powerful empire ever built without colonies will discover the same truth every empire before it learned. No currency rules forever. Every empire believes its power is different, smarter, more flexible, more advanced than anything that came before it. And in some ways, the dollar empire truly is. It does not rely on occupation. It does not require governors or colonies. It does not need flags planted on foreign soil. It runs on something far more fragile: belief. The final paradox of dollar power, the very privilege that makes the dollar supreme, also contains its weakness. Because when a nation can borrow without limit, when it can print without immediate consequence, when it can shift costs into the future endlessly, discipline erodes. Mounting debt stops feeling urgent. Deficits become normal. Political promises multiply. History is merciless on this point. Every empire that gains the ability to live beyond its means eventually does. Spain flooded Europe with silver and destroyed its own industry. Britain financed global dominance through debt until sterling cracked. America now carries obligations so large they can only be managed through confidence. As long as the world believes, the system holds. When belief wavers, the math reasserts itself. How financial empires really end, the end of monetary empires, never looks like collapse in the moment. There is no single day when the currency dies. No dramatic announcement. Instead, there is drift. More trade settled outside the system. More reserves diversified quietly. More hedging, fewer commitments. Trust doesn't vanish. It thins. And once thinning begins, it accelerates. This is how sterling faded. This is how gold lost its throne. This is how every reserve currency eventually steps aside. Not replaced overnight, but outgrown. The war continues, just quieter today. The secret war continues. Not in headlines, but in infrastructure. Not in speeches, but in payment rails. Not in declarations, but in alternatives. Digital currencies, bilateral trade deals, regional settlement systems. Each one is small. Each one is cautious. Together, they form a pattern. The world preparing for a future where dependence feels dangerous. What this means for the future: the dollar will not disappear tomorrow. It may not disappear in your lifetime, but its absolute dominance, the unquestioned throne, that is what history puts a timer on. Because no system built entirely on belief escapes scrutiny forever. And when confidence finally fractures, it does not return to the same shape. It evolves. The final lesson of the secret war: the most powerful empire in history was built without conquest. No legions, no colonies, no kings, just trust. That trust allowed the United States to finance wars, absorb crises, and export instability while remaining the refuge everyone ran toward. It was brilliant, and it was human. But history has a habit of humbling empires that mistake belief for permanence. The secret war that made the dollar king was never declared. But like all wars over power, it will not end quietly. It will end the same way all monetary empires do. Not with a crash, but with a choice. When the world decides whether it still wants one currency to rule them all. And when that moment comes, the lesson will be the same one written across centuries of financial history. Money is powerful. Trust is everything. And no throne built on belief stands forever. If this gave you a new way to see the world, subscribe. Because the answers were never hidden in the future. They were written, patiently, repeatedly, in the past.